Madam Speaker, permission to speak to the bill.
Delegate Miyares, you have the floor.
Madam Speaker, I appreciate Delegate Mullen's remarks, and I, on the benefit of being in the Courts of Justice Committee, have heard a lot of impassioned speeches on behalf of this legislation and a lot of remarks on behalf of those on death row. But despite all that testimony and speeches, the one thing I rarely hear and the one word rarely ever uttered are the victims. And like Mr. Mullen, I know he is a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor. I know talking to Delegate Bell and Delegate Gilbert, who are also prosecutors, the cases that haunt you aren't so much the defendants, but the victims who simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they give you a lot of training in law school, Madam Speaker, but they don't train you how to handle grief counseling. And so part of the reason why I ever ran for office was to try to give a voice to the voiceless. And since the victims have been completely left out in this debate over the death penalty, I thought I would share some of this with this body as we debate this monumental change in Virginia, whether the ultimate punishment is derived for those that commit the ultimate crimes. This right here is Stephanie. Stephanie Sipe. She was 20 years old, had a young child. Her boyfriend's name was Ivan. See, Ivan became enraged because Stephanie got pregnant and demanded child support. So he hired 2 killers to come to her home in Harrisonburg. The autopsy report, Madam Speaker, was pretty brutal. She put up a fight, Stephanie did. She had her hand almost severed and her head was almost cut off from all the knife wounds. She had a young toddler. When the police arrived, they found bloody footprints all over the house where the toddler was walking around after sitting and standing next to his mother's dead body for hours. That's Stephanie. I would like to introduce this chamber to Stacy Reed. She was 16 years old. See, Stacy's problem, according to her killer, Paul Powell, who was a monster, who was a white supremacist, is he had a problem with the fact that Stacy Reed was dating an African American. So he showed up at her house. He attempted to rape her. She also put up a heck of a struggle. And he knifed her repeatedly, over and over again. And then when he saw that she was on the ground and still breathing, he stomped on her throat over and over and over again. And then when he was done murdering Stacy, he wasn't done. He sat in the living room, he lit a cigarette, he got an iced tea, and he waited for 14-year-old Katie Reed to show up, her younger sister from school. When she showed up, he told her to go to her bedroom, where she found the body of her butchered sister. He then ordered Katie into the basement, where he raped her and stabbed her repeatedly. Stacy and Katie's father came home to finding Stacy's dead body and Katie in the basement raped and stabbed and miraculously alive. And for anybody who thinks that when you're in prison you can't inflict cruelty and pain on people, this monster, Paul Powell, mocked letters, wrote letters, and he wrote to the prosecutor. And he said, I'm just writing to tell you, since you want to kill me so GD bad for killing your blank loving whore, unless you want to let me out so I can kill the rest of the blank lovers and the blanks and everyone else in this country that's not white. P.S. Watch your back. Paul Powell was executed in March of 2010. Robert Gleason, he was in jail, prison, already for murder. For those who say that prison and life, again, they can't harp anyone, well, Robert Gleason was already in prison for murder. He then decided to torture his cellmate, 63-year-old Harvey Watson. He filled a sock with urine shoved it in his mouth, beat him, taunted him that he was about to die, then strangled him with his bed sheets. He went in front of a judge and said, the only way you could stop me from killing again is to give me the death penalty. They gave him life in prison again. He was given a 24-hour solitary confinement. He was allowed out 1 hour a day. 1 hour a day. He killed again. Another prison inmate. He strangled him through the bars. And they said he taunted the other inmates who were telling him and begging him to stop. Robert Gleason, executed. Daniel Lee Zirkle. Daniel Lee Zirkle was mad at the mother of his child, so he showed up at her house, but she wasn't there. But who was there was a 14-year-old Jessica Shiflett. Jessica Shiflett was just the babysitter. That was all she was. He stabbed her 5 times in the neck, and then he took 4-year-old Christina, his own daughter. He took her out of the house, he took her to a park, and he shoved a knife in her spine and murdered her. And this is from the autopsy report. The abrasions and bruises on the back of Christina's neck indicated she struggled when Zirkle stabbed her with the knife. She knew what was coming. She was 4 years old. When the police officer came to investigated him and told him the horror that he was going to be donating to the headstone of little 4-year-old Christina, Daniel Zirkle said, well, tell that bitch checkmate. Executed. 2002. Ricky Gray. Ricky Gray, one of the most notorious killers. This is his wife, Treva Gray, 35 years old, strangled and beaten and buried in a shallow grave. He then later went on with his accomplice Dandridge to Richmond, Virginia. After taking Treva Gray his own wife's life, he traveled to Richmond, where he encountered the Harvey family. This is the Harvey family. That's 49-year-old Brian, 39-year-old Kathy, 9-year-old Stella, and 4-year-old Ruby. It was an unseasonably warm New Year's Day, and the perpetrators, Mr. Gray, walked into their home, forced Brian and Kathy and Ruby into the basement of their home, where they bound them. And then the doorbell rang. And see, it was little Stella. Little Stella was coming home from a sleepover. She was 9 years old. She was being dropped off. They let Kathy upstairs to let her back in the house, and she had no idea that she was walking into a living hell. Mr. Gray, this monster of a human being, bound them, duct taped them, strangled them, stabbed them, and beat Brian, Kathy, and Ruby with a hammer to death. Stella, 9-year-old Stella from the sleepover, she died of smoke inhalation because they doused the house on fire and set it on fire. In other words, Stella was alive to see her family butchered right in front of her.
I'm not gonna let
Ricky Gray executed in 2017, but of course he wasn't done. Ricky Gray wasn't done. See, additional murder victims here. He killed 21-year-old Ashley. She was only 21 because he suspected she may snitch on him. And they also murdered her 46-year-old mother, Mary, and her 55-year-old stepfather. Again, bound and strangled to death. 7 murders. Ricky Gray executed in 2017. Now, Anthony Juniper, who's right now on death row, and so this bill directly affects them. He killed, murdered Keisha, Reuben, Nakaya, and Shariah. Nakaya was 4, Shariah was 2 years old. They all died in the master bedroom because he was enraged. He killed Keisha and her brother, Reuben, and they said the 2-year-old Shariah was being held in her mother's arm when she was murdered. This is who's on death row right now. And so as we spend this discussion about whether the death penalty and the status of it is, of course, it has to be used extremely rare. Of course, You have to have proper due process protection. Of course, with all the scientific advances we have in evidence collection. But if there's one thing, and going through all these death penalty cases, Madam Speaker, the last 48 hours, if there's one word to describe what happened to these victims, it's just cruelty. Unimaginable cruelty on a scale that's hard to even process, the evil that was conducted on these victims. They did not die with a last meal. They didn't die with the benefit of seeing their priest or pastor or rabbi. They didn't die in the comfort of a hospital bed with their loved ones. They died with sheer terror on their hearts, with people often taunting them. And so what the death penalty says is for certain crimes that are so cruel and depraved, the Timothy McVeighs of the world, that yes, the ultimate punishment has to be available for the ultimate crime. So just understand today, if you vote to abolish the death penalty, you're also putting people on the course that one day they will be back potentially on the street. And I keep hearing, well, parole, life without the possibility of parole. We know in Virginia that's no longer true, don't we? Because this is Michael Connor, 23-year-old Richmond police officer, butchered and murdered by Vincent Martin, execution style. Vincent Martin sentenced to 30 years in prison, got out in 6 years. Out not even a year, commits another armed robbery, murders a Richmond police officer. He's back on the street and his victims weren't even notified. Vincent Martin was given life without the possibility of parole, which to me means they never get out. But we know now in today's Virginia, that doesn't mean that anymore. Sarah Jameson is 15 years old. Gregory Joyner strangled, raped, and murdered her, buried her in a shallow ditch. Family didn't find her for over a week. Gregory Joyner's back on the street. He was also given life without the possibility of parole. He's still in his 40s. He gets to spend the next 40 years having Thanksgivings with his family. And Sarah Jameson never even got to celebrate her prom. So I'm holding these photos up so everybody knows the faces of the victims that seem to be absent from these discussions. And understand, for this body, the ultimate crimes, with all the constitutional protection we can afford, deserves the ultimate punishment. And I beg this body, please, do not forget the victims. Thank you, Madam Speaker.